Amara hesitated as Clara's voice cut through his thoughts. Are you sure? Once this is out there, you can't take it back. People might attack you for it, or worse, twist it into something it's not. I don't care, Amara snapped. Then, softening his tone, he added, I can't let this go, Clara. If they covered something up, if they let her die because of negligence or worse, then we can't let them hide it. Reluctantly, Clara nodded. Later that day, Amara contacted a local news station, leaving messages with every reporter he could find. Hours passed with no response. Desperation gnawed at him until, finally, a young journalist named Julia Reyes called back. I saw your email, she said. And I watched the footage. Amara gripped the phone tightly. And there's definitely something strange going on, Julia said. But this isn't going to be easy. Funeral homes don't just open coffins after burial without a reason or permission. They didn't have permission, Amara said quickly. I would have known. Then we need more evidence, Julia replied. Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you have. Amara hung up, feeling the first glimmer of hope since Princess's death. The next day, Amara and Clara met Julia at a quiet CAF on the edge of town. She was younger than Amara had expected, mid-20s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I want to help, she said, pulling out a notepad. But if we're going to run this story, we need to dig deeper. We need proof of negligence or a motive. Over the next few days, Julia started piecing together the puzzle. She dug into the funeral home's history, uncovering previous complaints of mishandling bodies and falsifying records. Amara wasn't surprised, but it still sent chills down his spine. At the same time, Amara and Clara worked to track down employees who might talk. After several dead ends, they found a former worker willing to meet Foster, a man in his 40s who'd left the funeral home under murky circumstances. They met him in a diner late one evening. Foster looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. I don't know what you expect me to say, he began, fidgeting with his coffee cup. The truth, Amara said, leaning forward. My daughter's body was tampered with after the funeral. I need to know why. Foster's hands shook. You think you're the first one? Amara froze. What do you mean? Foster swallowed hard. They've been doing this for years. Cutting corners, covering up mistakes. Sometimes it's sloppy embalming. Other times it's worse. Worse? Clara asked. Foster hesitated. They reuse caskets, he said finally. Switch out bodies to save space. Sometimes they damage the remains and have to fix them in a hurry. If your daughter's body was moved, it's because they were hiding something. Amara's stomach turned. He wanted to scream, to flip the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. Will you go on record? Julia asked, breaking the silence. Foster shook his head. I can't. They'll come after me. They already came after me, Amara said quietly. They vandalized my car. They made it clear they don't want me asking questions. But I'm not backing down. Foster looked at him for a long moment before sighing. I'll think about it, he said, then quickly left the diner. Amara wasn't sure if they'd see him again, but he wasn't giving up. Over the next week, Julia pushed the investigation further. She found records indicating that Princess's embalming process had been rushed and incomplete. The funeral home had altered documents to make it seem routine, but the inconsistencies were glaring. Finally, Julia published the first article. It detailed Amara's suspicions, the recording, and the funeral home's shady history. The story spread quickly, sparking outrage in the community. People began sharing their own experiences of discrimination and neglect. But the attention also brought danger. Late one night, Amara awoke to find the word "Stop Digging" spray painted on his garage door. His phone buzzed with anonymous threats, but Amara refused to be silenced. With Julia's help, he filed a police report and pressed forward. The story gained national attention, forcing authorities to launch an investigation into the funeral home. Former employees came forward, corroborating Foster's claims and exposing even more horrifying practices. It wasn't easy, but Amara's persistence paid off. The funeral home was shut down, its owners facing criminal charges. And while nothing could bring Princess back, Amara found solace in knowing he'd uncovered the truth and prevented more families from suffering the same pain. As he stood at Princess's grave, now properly marked and cared for, Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. Amara nodded, a tear sliding down his cheek. "For her. Always for her." The phone rang non-stop with blocked numbers, some leaving threatening messages. Clara wanted him to stop, but Amara refused. "We're too close," he said. "They are scared. That means we're doing something right." The police, under pressure from the media, reluctantly reopened the investigation. Amara watched as the wheels of justice turned painfully slowly. Meanwhile, Julia discovered a deeper connection. One of the funeral home's owners had ties to local hospitals, raising questions about referrals and profits. The pieces were falling into place, but Amara knew the fight wasn't over. One evening, as he sat with Clara reviewing evidence, his phone buzzed. It was Kevin. "They are coming after me," he said, his voice shaking. "I need protection. I'll testify, but you have to help me." Amara's blood ran cold. He agreed to meet Kevin the next day, but something told him the danger was far from over. As he looked back at Princess's unfinished drawing, the one she had left on the table the day she died, he felt his resolve harden. He wouldn't let her down. Not now. Not ever. Amara barely slept the night before the hearing. He sat in his living room, surrounded by piles of documents, recordings, and scribbled notes. The clock ticked toward dawn, but he didn't notice the time. His thoughts spun endlessly about Princess, the funeral home, and what it had taken to get this far. The threats hadn't stopped. Anonymous phone calls still came late at night, their voices low and menacing. "You regret this," one caller had hissed. Amara had simply hung up and set his phone to record any further calls. He was past fear now. All he cared about was seeing this through. Kevin Foster, the funeral home's former employee, had finally agreed to testify in court. His decision came with its own risks. He'd already lost his job and now feared for his safety. Amara had offered him a place to stay, but Kevin refused, opting instead to move in with a cousin outside the city. "Just keep pushing," Kevin had said before leaving. "Don't let them bury this." The phrase haunted Amara, "Don't let them bury this." By the time Amara arrived at the courthouse the next morning, the air felt electric. Protesters lined the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for Princess" and "No more neglect." Journalists crowded the entrance, shoving microphones toward anyone who looked important. Clara met him at the doors, clutching his arm. "You ready for this?" she asked. Amara nodded, though his stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't ready. He'd never be ready for this. But he couldn't back down now. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The funeral home's lawyers sat stiffly at their table, dressed in tailored suits and flanked by assistants. Across from them, Amara sat with his attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Angela Reed. She had been recommended by Julia Reyes, the journalist who'd broken the story. Angela leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. No matter what they throw at you, don't lose your temper." Amara nodded, gripping the edge of the table as the judge entered the room. The opening statements were brutal. The funeral home's lawyers painted Amora as a grieving father who'd let paranoia cloud his judgment. They attacked the hidden camera footage, calling it inadmissible and unreliable. They claimed the voices were distorted by poor audio quality and could have come from anywhere. Angela countered with the facts: Princess's bruises, the dirt under her nails, and the funeral home's history of complaints. Then she played the recording for the court. The whispers filled the room, their casual cruelty cutting through the air like knives. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Just get it done. They'll never check. Amora watched the jurors' faces as the audio played. Some flinched, others looked away, and a few stared straight ahead, their expressions hardening. Then Kevin took the stand. His testimony was shaky at first, his voice cracked, and he fidgeted with his hands. But as he spoke, his confidence grew. He described the funeral home's practices in detail, explaining how they'd reused caskets and tampered with bodies to cover mistakes. They told us no one would notice, Kevin said, gesturing toward Amora. The room fell silent. Amora's heart pounded. He knew that moment mattered more than anything else. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The defense tried to discredit Kevin, pointing to his troubled employment history and accusing him of seeking revenge. But Kevin held firm, repeating the damning details with unflinching clarity. The trial stretched on for days, with both sides presenting their evidence. Julia continued to report on the case, her article sparking outrage and support from the community. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, their numbers growing as more people came forward with their own stories of neglect and abuse at the funeral home. Finally, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. The funeral home was found guilty of gross negligence and misconduct. The owners faced hefty fines and the possibility of losing their licenses. For Amora, it was a bittersweet victory. Nothing could bring Princess back, but her story had sparked a movement, a demand for accountability and justice. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Amora felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "We did it, Princess. We didn't let them bury this." The defense tried to discredit Kevin by pointing to his termination and suggesting he held a grudge against the funeral home, but Kevin stood firm, refusing to back down. By the time the closing arguments ended, Amora felt drained. The judge called a recess, and Amora stepped outside for air. Clara followed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens," she said, "you fought for her." Amora swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's not enough," he said. "Not yet." The verdict came 3 days later. The courtroom was packed when the jury returned. Amora held his breath as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. "Guilty," she said. A wave of relief washed over Amora, but it was short-lived. The funeral home was ordered to pay damages, and several employees, including the director, faced criminal charges. But the verdict couldn't bring Princess back. After the sentencing, Amora visited her grave. The cemetery felt different now, less oppressive, though the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. He knelt by the headstone, running his fingers over her name. "I did it, baby," he whispered. "I made them see you." Clara stood a few feet away, giving him space. When he finally rose, she slipped her hand into his. "They can't hurt anyone else now," she said. Amora nodded, though the ache in his chest remained. In the weeks that followed, Amora focused on building something positive out of his loss. With Clara's help, he started the Princess Johnson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting discrimination and negligence in healthcare and funeral services. Julia Reyes continued to cover the story, keeping public attention on the case and pushing for legislative changes. The threats eventually stopped, but Amora never forgot the fear that had gripped him during those long nights. He kept a camera that had started it all, a reminder of the fight he'd won and the daughter he'd lost. One afternoon, while cleaning out Princess's room, Amora found her unfinished drawing, the one of them standing under a tree. He framed it and hung it in the living room. "Always together, Dad," the words beneath the picture echoed in his mind as he stood back and looked at it. Tears welled in his eyes, but this time, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of love, of hope, and of a promise fulfilled. Amora stepped outside, letting the warm breeze wash over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. Princess was gone, but her memory was alive, and so was the fight for justice she'd inspired. As he stood beneath the setting sun, Amora knew the battle wasn't over. There were still families out there, families like his, who needed someone to stand up for them. And he was ready. If you were moved by this story, please share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to African Tales by Rosa for more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching.